So good afternoon, everyone. We are going to have a talk today for the brown bag session from Professor Philip Bess. Philip Bess has been teaching in the graduate urban design and theory with a particular interest in Catholic and classical humanist intellectual and artistic traditions in the context of modern American life and the contemporary culture of architecture and urban design. From 2004 till 2014, he was the School of Architecture's director of the graduate studies. Under his direction between 2006 and 2018, the school's graduate urban design studio completed a series of master plan proposals that have been listed in his CV, but are too extensive to talk about right now. And one of those projects, which happened in fall 2011 and has continued since, is the Graduate Urban Design Studio, which was a multi-year project called After Burnham, the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago, 2109, so 100 years from 2009, which envisions metropolitan Chicago as the bicentennial of the 1909 plan of Chicago, and is devoted to exploring whether and how Notre Dame's professed classicist or classical humanist ideals might be applied at the scale of modern metropolis. The 2011 and 2012 Chicago studios explored general City of Chicago and the Northeastern Illinois regional issues, with subsequent studios' proposal for various other aspects of Chicago. I'm going to let Phil explain this more in detail, but within the short limit of time we have, I would like to include and welcome Professor Bess. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for tuning in. Thanks as well to Krupali and to Caroline Maloney for overseeing the School of Architecture research programs and for the invitation to speak today. The multi-year, large and ongoing project of which I'm going to show small snippets represents the work of many hands and much conversation, for all of which I am grateful. But I want especially at the outset to acknowledge and thank the multiple institutional and financial patrons of my 35 years of research such as it is, which include the following: the Society for American Baseball Research, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Graham Foundation for the Advancement of the Fine Arts, the Andrews University Office of Scholarly Research, the Historical Society, once domiciled within Boston University, which was the major funder of the Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109, the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, the Notre Dame School of Architecture, and the Notre Dame Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and Public Life. And then most recently in the fall of 2019, the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies. My heartfelt thanks to them all. I will add that as the Chicago 2109 project has developed over time, I've presented it publicly in a number of places in time allotments, both more and less expansive. But only once have I come away feeling somewhat satisfied that it was presented well. And that was both to a smaller audience and within a larger time frame than this. So here's hoping that today will nevertheless represent progress. About 3 years ago, I was asked to evaluate a proposed book, tentatively entitled Architecture and Sacrament, a Critical Theory, since published in 2020. The author was David Wang, a now emeritus professor of architecture, retired from a secular Research One university, which may be significant. Professor Wang was both educated as a modernist and taught in modernist schools of architecture over his entire career, is still habitually modernist in his antipathy to what we at Notre Dame sometimes too blithely refer to as traditional architecture and urbanism, also suspicious of neo-traditional town planning and the CNU, and is himself a Chinese-American evangelical Protestant, that is, non-sacramental Christian. Nevertheless, he writes in the draft introduction to his book of his changes of mind with respect to contemporary architectural theory and its impossible agenda of postmodern architectural meaning as representation. I can't go into details here, but can report that Professor Wang exhibits admirable patience in demonstrating contemporary postmodern architectural theory's intellectual incoherence. But then, noting that, quote, it was once the precise burden of architecture to capture transcendent truths in physical forms, end quote, and pondering a pre-modern Western Christian practice of entombing the dead in church buildings, and pondering further the essence of sacramentality less in terms of meaning than in terms of participation in a larger sacred order, Professor Wang writes this, quote, we moderns might think it ridiculous to regard a cathedral as heaven. This book suggests that perhaps it wasn't so ridiculous. My view is that a merely representational architecture impoverishes life experience, and the following chapters unpack this appraisal. Consider this. It is no accident that parallel to the emergence of the postmodern movements is also the emergence of angst over having lost sense of place. In earlier times, when participatory potential enlivened design thinking and making, sense of place, or its close cousin, sense of community, was present. But now, architectural theorists seem to have realized that somewhere along the road to pure relativity, oops, where did sense of community go? I also suggest that the impetus to conserve nature, captured by the general but elusive moniker sustainable design, is curiously devoid of wonder and amazement over the mysterious organicism of the very nature it aims to conserve. For all of its widespread momentum, sustainable design these days largely reduces to the numerical calculus of a lead spreadsheet. I jump, and Professor Wang continues, quote, to return to Sacramentum, a smaller party participating in a vastly extended reality such that the former receives the benefits of the latter. Early Christian theology co-opted this formulation, originating as a Roman military oath, and made it key to explaining a believer's participation in the church. By the time of Augustine in the 5th century AD, baptism and Eucharist were clearly identified as sacraments that bound the faithful to a, quote, new dispensation of fellowship, end quote. For at least 1.5 millennia, European civilization largely equals the history of the Christian church. How Christian theology absorbed and processed the ideas of Greco-Roman antiquity spawned many of the lineaments of Western culture as we know them today. End quote. What Professor Wang discovered is that his book could not deal with architecture as sacrament without treating Christian theological works as primary sources, which in turn led to this remarkable pair of questions. But what if there is no separation between Christian theology and architectural theory? How can this interdisciplinary overlay shed light on certain issues in current architectural theory? In my research, I find sacramentum to be the point of intersection between these two domains. This book summarizes these findings, end quote. Now, those of you who know me will suspect rightly that to me these passages were and are like catnip. For those of you who don't know me, here's why. I've had an unorthodox career as both a professional and an academic, and it's probably not a coincidence that one of my intellectual heroes is G.K. Chesterton, who once wrote a book entitled A Short History of England that is rumored to contain within its pages no dates at all, 0. Though in fact it includes 4 dates, one of which may be wrong. Which is to say, I'm not uninterested in research, but my research has always been both episodic and idiosyncratic, and fundamentally hedgehoggish, though it is an obsession with a large subject. It literally never occurred to me to study architecture until I was 23 years old, when in the midst of a personal crisis, I had occasion to work for a summer on the construction of a rural house with a couple of young builder developers who had also designed the building. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Nevertheless, from that summer, 3 years before I started architecture school, 6 years before my first job in an office, 11 years before I went solo, and 18 years before I entered academia, I have had basically one project my entire adult professional life, trying to understand more clearly whether and how the buildings and cities human beings make participate in the city of God. The New Jerusalem that Christian scripture and tradition tell us is the telos. Telos is the telos, or end of all creation. The happy destiny of every human being who, in the end, freely chooses to return to God the love that God has shown to us. That love of God, which Christian faith and teaching also tell us necessarily entails love of one's neighbor and even love of one's enemies, finds its fullness, its apotheosis in a city, with a capital C, city. How can that be? And what does that have to do with the earthly, literally mundane cities we make in the very little bit of space-time allotted to each of us and from generation to generation? I'm not sure I've ever articulated that life project this way in public. And for most of my life, I've not even been able to articulate it clearly to myself, though it's long been a strong intuition. But I too am closing in on emeritus status, and that's my story. Inchoate as that story has been to me, in retrospect, even my earliest independent research activities seem a manifestation of this interest in the connection between earthly cities and the New Jerusalem. From my earliest writings with Howard Decker on moral order and formal order in Chicago, which eventually made a book of essays that may have sold as many as a dozen copies, of which I probably have 10. From that to my 1980s work on urban baseball parks, which was motivated in part by an interest in play as an anthropological activity, the subjective experience of which entails stepping out of mundane time into eternity. In neighborhood baseball parks, theaters, concert halls, or any architectural or urban space simultaneously devoted both to beauty and to forms of playful activity in some way hinting at the transcendent. And these concerns have always been present in my teaching as well, especially in my urban design studios, usually sotto voce, but sometimes loudly. From our current vantage point in history, the wide recovery of a durable and beautiful culture of building and places as default practices is a long-term cultural project. The hardest work of that project will occur in situ, in existing cities and suburbs, perhaps necessarily in some out-of-the-way places, including perhaps South Bend, Indiana. But some of that work in service to that recovery may be visionary. For the last decade or so at Notre Dame, given our classical humanist approach to architecture and urbanism, our proximity to Chicago, and Chicago's astonishing history and troubled present, I've been working with Notre Dame students and alumni to begin thinking about the bicentennial of Daniel Burnham's 1909 plan of Chicago by looking both backward and forward. Drawing on classical humanist traditions of architecture and planning and the imperatives of Catholic social teaching, including the dignity of the human person, social solidarity, subsidiarity in the organization of political life, law and government for the common good, with special attention to the needs of the poor, environmental stewardship, religious freedom, such themes. The ambition has been to envision metropolitan Chicago in 2109 as a flourishing agrarian urban unit, and to imagine holistically and with uncommon care the substance of that flourishing. Because we know, or should know, that good architectural and urban form, though necessary, is not enough to assure human flourishing. And indeed, that the larger culture itself makes good architectural and urban form much more difficult than it should be. The Notre Dame Plan of Chicago 2109 is a multi-year, multi-studio project originating in the now defunct Graduate Urban Design Concentration and corresponding studios, and subsequently supported by several sizable research grants. The initial investigations and documentation were executed in the 2011 and 2012 Graduate Urban Design Studios that looked first at the city of Chicago and subsequently the metropolitan region. I would say in retrospect, I would reverse that. If I were doing it again, I would reverse it. And it really wasn't until I looked at the city that I realized that we really had to take a hard look at the region, but live and learn. Generous grants funded the assistance of 2011 graduate urban design alums Jennifer and John Griffin, who produced a large number of drawings for Chicago's historic center, a few of which we will see shortly. And 2009 graduate alum Will Dowdy, who assisted in final project drawing edits and co-authored with me a refereed paper for Chicago 2109 Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment that was subsequently presented at Notre Dame at a Notre Dame Environmental Change Initiative conference in 2017. And here I'll put in a plug for Kupali's Environmental Change Initiative presentation on Wednesday. All right, y'all be there. The Chicago 2109 project itself was prompted by dismay at the tendentious ideological character of the Chicago architectural establishment's observance in 2009 of the centennial of the Plan of Chicago. And Chicago 2109 was undertaken for several reasons. I'll say three. To critique what Chicago had become 100 years after Burnham and Bennett's and Edward Bennett's co-authors Plan of Chicago. To critique the original Plan of Chicago itself, and to envision Chicago at the bicentennial of the plan and what Chicago might look like in 2109 by beginning with Chicago as it exists in the present, but guided over the next century by the holistic vision and classical humanist sensibilities of the 1909 Burnham Plan as an authoritative reference point. I think of it as an exercise in, and not as a contradiction, an exercise in Aristotelian idealism. It's Aristotelian in the sense that it works from the bottom up and takes seriously the material world. It's ideal in the sense that goes beyond Aristotle, but where the ideal is less Platonic than it is the ideal of the city of God as the end of history. I thought then, and think now, that the Notre Dame School of Architecture might be the only institution in the country or world that could undertake such a project. Because only at Notre Dame are classical humanist architectural sensibilities so deeply embedded in the history and culture of the school, in the faculty, and in the curriculum. And only at Notre Dame can these sensibilities be grounded in the religious culture and metaphysical realist assumptions of a larger university community in which moral and cultural relativity does not completely reign, and where the objective character of beauty, goodness, and truth remain arguable propositions. The size and scale and assumptions of Chicago 2109 cause many to whom it has been presented to misunderstand it and to mischaracterize it. That it's some kind of latter-day Robert Moses-like utopian political proposal, some kind of urban renewal project, entailing condemnation of large swaths of private property and a forced shutdown of post-war automobile suburbs. But this is not correct. Our current culture of building in both cities and suburbs is collapsing of its own weight. I do think, with many, that post-war suburbs in their current form will have definitively failed by the beginning of the 22nd century. And this for a combination of reasons, but primarily demographic and economic. The former related to below replacement fertility rates with certain set demographic consequences that will become increasingly apparent over time. And the latter having to do with the cost of suburban infrastructure incommensurate with the low population densities and tax base needed to finance it. But this is not to say our cities are currently in great shape themselves, or necessarily will be, only that the kinds of changes we were trying to imagine for Chicago 2109 require us to do something different, but not unprecedented, different from what we were doing now, but not unprecedented. Chicago 2109 is therefore not a unitary proposal to be imposed, but rather a visionary framework within which to promote, over time, 1,000 different projects. Nevertheless, its scope and ambition are comprehensive. Addressing problems and proposing some solutions about issues ranging from land use, and I'll ask you to just take a look at this slide and compare across the top. On the top left was land use in metropolitan Chicago in 1936, with the orange representing settlements and the white representing open agricultural or natural landscape. In the center, it's what Chicago looked like in 2009 after 60 years of automobile sprawl. And then on the right, the proposed land use patterns that we imagined for 2109, which I'll say, when we started this project was not, we didn't have this in mind. We came to these conclusions actually from examining the state of infrastructure in the metropolitan Chicago region and the history of development in metropolitan Chicago. So we were looking at this series of interrelated issues. I mean, any students out there who are listening who perhaps have read in one of your theology classes, have read Laudato Si, know that Francis throughout it employs the recurring refrain, everything is connected. Well, when you look at Chicago, metropolitan Chicago, and the way that we were looking at it, you find the same thing, that everything is connected: the physical form, the culture, demographics, economics, land use, water, all that kind of stuff. So, the comprehensive ambitions of the project, we're looking at land use, which for our purposes, we make a fundamental distinction between rural land and urban land, which you can see. And then we look, related to that, we look at settlement types, their size, their density, their form, their structure. And then we look to regional and city transportation, existing and some few expansions of the existing, particularly rail networks, and in one case, in the city of Chicago, a rapid bus transit proposal. But we're basically building on the existing rail infrastructure of metropolitan Chicago, both to the areas in the 7-county region beyond Chicago, but also within the city of Chicago. And then looking at the effects of that on land use, right? So we're going back to this slide, and if you look at the upper right, that's the land use pattern that follows the existing transportation networks in metropolitan Chicago. And if I can go back to this slide, the kind of governing rule of that is that city land rarely extends more than a half mile from a rail stop, and it never extends more than a mile from a rail stop. That town land, which is developed along the rail lines that go out into, to the various points of the compass, at least western points of the compass, never extends more than 1 mile from a rail stop. And city and town settlements, therefore, are considered urban settlements, whereas villages and hamlets, also considered urban, are built in rural locations. The proposition is that they be located and built at intersections of existing state and/or county roads, and that they're governed by certain certain kinds of ideas about density and maximum size. So that this is the land use pattern that you get. And I won't talk about it much, but a little bit later, I'll mention a metropolitan region-wide revenue neutral land value tax. But one of the implications of this is that it's not that you cannot develop rural land in metropolitan Chicago. It's that the moment you start to develop rural land, you are paying urban land taxes. So it's the intention behind the idea is that you pay the full cost of infrastructure when you settle, when you start to inhabit rural land. So let's see, where am I? We took a look at storm and wastewater management specific to both the city of Chicago and the metropolitan region, specifically a kind of two-tiered form of wastewater treatment. One that I'm sure you may not necessarily know, that Chicago has a kind of famous, elaborate water treatment infrastructure. Deep tunnels, that's literally the name of it, buried, far below the earth, that still can't prevent flooding, because Chicago was basically, it was built in a swamp. And they reversed the Chicago River famously, and that has problems. And one of our proposals is to re-reverse the Chicago River. But as you can see down below, that this is kind of the pattern of wastewater treatment that we imagine, that cities, use water treatment plants, but that the towns and hamlets and villages employ local constructed wetlands wastewater treatment, and treat it locally and put it back into the ground on site as fresh water. We also have a proposal that has to do with repurposing the interstate highways within the city limits of Chicago to turn them back into multi-use urban corridors, boulevards, rail lines, parks, wetlands, real estate. And I show it here because it becomes important for the last project that I'm going to show up in this area here. But this is all, the one place where we didn't do that was the Stevenson, because the Stevenson is really just an entirely industrial corridor and it's raised. And so we let that go into the city. But all of the other interstate highways that enter the city limits of Chicago get repurposed, which I want to say is a far less ambitious project than the original project of making all of those interstate highways run through the city of Chicago. We look at the recovery. Well, and let's see. Yes, okay. I mentioned the recovery of in-city land lost to interstate highways. We look at historic city and regional housing types across an urban transect. And I would note that the 8 housing types that you see of the 12 or the 13 presented are all 3 stories or less. And this has significant implications when employed across an urban transect. Significant. The effects because the effects of these generally walk-up housing types, both regional and in terms of the city, they have a big impact on the recapture of the increase of density in a kind of comfortable walking environment. And the purpose of this is to show what sprawl looks like at about 2,800 people per square mile. What a nice railroad suburb looks like. This is in LaGrange, Illinois. That gets you a street section like this that is not that dissimilar to this street section in Chicago, but because the suburban, the rail suburb is a single family house, the development on 50 to 60-foot wide lots with no accessory dwelling units, you get about 7,000 people per square mile, which is, you know, about 2.5 times what a standard suburb is, but is only about a quarter of what you get in this street section in Chicago, which is made up primarily of 2 flats and 3 flats and gives you 28,000 people per square mile, which gives you also a lot of opportunities for retail activity within walking distance. So the idea that density in city living necessarily entails high rises or uncomfortable living conditions is you know, when you think about living across a transect, that is to some extent subject to taste, but it's a misnomer to suggest that this is a bad way of life, and makes no sense to anybody who's lived in this kind of environment. It has effects on the recovery of landscape, right? Because this is the current condition in Chicago, in metropolitan Chicago. This is the proposed condition in metropolitan Chicago. On the left, you're currently we're talking in these seven counties of about 4,000 square miles, of which, as of 2009, more than 50% of that was occupied by human settlement. Whereas in 2109, in this pattern, only 613 square miles of that 4,000 square miles are occupied, which represents a recovery of about 70% of the land here, a recovery of that for either agricultural or natural landscape. And this breaks down, you know, the densities in the city and in the metro region. And then this is what happens in the city of Chicago, governed, you know, in the same way with respect to land that is occupied and to which infrastructure services are extended relative to its proximity to rail lines, which enables, in this case, the city of Chicago is 231 square miles. It currently has 222 of those square miles occupied, right? So there's 9 square miles of green open land currently in the city of Chicago. And under the Chicago 2109 proposal, there would be 166 square miles, which would mean, what, 30, that'd be 65 square miles of land. So 7 times the land, 7 times the open land in the city of Chicago recovered by this pattern of land use. We deal with transect-related sector plans, right? So the part of the agenda that needs to happen is a change in the legal environment that governs development in metropolitan Chicago. So so the rural to urban transect becomes a basis for regional sector plans. It becomes the basis for county sector plans, you know, again, based on existing transportation in a rural to urban transect. And Kane County became kind of our guinea pig for this, so that this is the land use pattern. You can see the land use pattern is based upon the transportation pattern. And then this is a proposal for a revenue neutral land value tax in Kane County. And you can see that there's a gradation of zones, of tax zones that where rural land is taxed at the lowest rate. So that the largest parcels, anything 40 acres and over in rural land there's a factor actually named after the student who did this exercise, call it the S factor, that is the basis of the tax system, where in the rural land you pay 1. The factor is you pay 1 times that factor per acre. And there's a gradation where it goes up to, I think, like 20 times that for 10-acre parcels, 10 to 40-acre parcels, and it goes up to I don't know, a couple hundred or something like that for land between 5 and 10-acre parcels. And then when you get into the least expensive urban land tax category, it's something like a factor of 2,400 greater, right, than developing out on open farmland, right? So that if you can develop open farmland, but not at ag land tax rates. So anyway, that's related to the transect. The transect also obviously relates to form-based codes for as-of-right traditional neighborhood designs. This is a project that was done by one of the students as part of their thesis that included a form-based code. And then finally, to the symbolic content of Chicago's formal order itself. This is all the mundane, right? This is the sacred and the mundane. I've been talking about the mundane, so I'm going to talk about the sacred now to finish up. This last issue in particular is addressed by our proposal to establish a north-south sacred cross-axis at the heart of Chicago's historic center that gives places of prominence for representative houses of worship from Chicago's existing religious communities, and is at the same time a physical embodiment in the public realm of America's historic principles of religious free exercise and non-establishment, right? So this is the area that we're talking about. The area in green is this. I'll enlarge this, this is, and I was telling Krupali that about an hour before the lecture, I cut my number of slides down from 56 to 27. So you should all be grateful for that. But most of those had to do with, had to do with showing this latter project and its relationship to the Burnham Plan. And I can't really show the precedents, but if you're interested in those, just get in touch with me. I'm happy to show you. But it's essentially this is the idea. Let me go back. That Burnham established this civic axis in an east-west direction on a city hall that has since been replaced by the Jane Burns Circle interchange, where all the freeways in the region meet. And our proposal is to reestablish that civic axis east to west, locate a city hall in this position where Burnham originally intended, and then create a cross-axis, which we're characterizing as a sacred cross-axis that is open and fronted by representative buildings of religious communities throughout Chicago. And this is kind of the plan view of that on the right. So these are just buildings, right, that we sampled, sacred buildings that we sampled, that we locate along this boulevard. So this is the east-west axis. This is City Hall, and these are all the sacred buildings that occur on what we're calling Columbian Exposition Boulevard. This is the east elevation of these three blocks right here, right? So this is a church, this is City Hall, this is a synagogue right here, and these are the mundane fabric buildings, right, that occur along the streetscape, but punctuated by the religious buildings, and then the singular civic building as City Hall. This is John Griffin's aerial perspective of the intersection of the sacred axis and the civic axis looking from the southwest. I want to go back and actually I want to say something about the Griffins. John Griffin did the aerial perspectives. Jennifer Griffin did all the plan work, including this, which this is about 8 or 9 miles north to south. 4 minutes? Okay, I can do that. I can finish in 4 minutes. This is 8 or 9 miles to the south, and this involves actually, because if you recall, the interstates have been done away with, right? In our imagination in 2109, but this is basically the track that they course that the Dan Ryan tracks until it hits the Circle interchange, then it becomes the Kennedy and heads up this way, right? So Jennifer Griffin filled all that in and located some existing civic buildings and imagined some new civic buildings. And as far as I can tell, and we talked about this, but she pretty much had a free hand. She got everything right in terms of plausible blocks and how they're laid out, how they switch direction according to what they're facing, and it's just remarkable. When I look at this, it's remarkable that she did this at this scale so well, and that goes through in this as well, because this doesn't show alleys here; it just shows blocks. But this shows the alleys, right? So if you look at this closely, it's just great because you won't find any mistakes. Or at least I haven't found any mistakes. So this is, yeah, so these are the buildings. This is the, the street elevation, partial street elevation facing east. This is John's aerial perspective looking to the northwest. And then, and this is my last slide, which is the Civic axis looking to the east, to Lake Michigan. So here in the foreground, right, here's City Hall, here's the sacred axis, here's the Civic axis in this direction. And actually you can see, I have other drawings. You can see that there's still certain high rises that remain, but many of them are gone. And again, that doesn't have anything to do, we're not proposing the demolition of any high rises, but what we're imagining here, and it's partly our own judgment, but it's partly because we simply followed the city of Chicago's designation for historic buildings, like historic landmarks. And so what we're imagining this to be is to represent the tall buildings that are loved enough to be and built well enough to be maintained for 100 years. So this is, but we're imagining a transition, a shift, necessitated in some ways by reality and climate issues and sensitivity to embodied energy in building materials, where the default condition is one of bearing wall construction, 6 stories downtown, 3 or 4 stories, 5 stories in the neighborhoods, and occasional high rises or occasional taller buildings in certain spots. But let me wrap up. Nobody involved with Chicago 2109 presumes achieving any of these ambitions will be easy, nor do we imagine the ambition represented by our sacred axis proposal in particular would go uncontested. It was not uncontested even in the design studio in which it originated. Nevertheless, we envision this kind of alternative developmental urbanism for Chicago because we believe that the current trajectories of secularist culture, the global economy, hypermodern architecture, and suburban sprawl ultimately are economically, environmentally, and anthropologically unsustainable. If human beings have any kind of decent future, it seems to me most likely it will be in traditional cities in which religions are recognized for the social and spiritual goods they provide and hold places of honor in the formal order of the city. In the meantime, to reiterate the institutional context of this ongoing project, let us be mindful that the great privilege of being a student or faculty member at the University of Notre Dame is to seek, teach, and serve truth within an academic community that unites persons of different ages, roles, scholarly disciplines, and points of view as equals before God, while grounding the academic vocation itself in nature, history, and divine generosity. At our best, we reason together in multiple modes: empirical, philosophical, moral, artistic, across scales, regional to domestic, cosmic to microcosmic, perhaps even the microcosmic in the microscopic, toward ends that are beautiful and good and true. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions if there's anybody out there.
If people want to ask questions,
how do I do that? I'm happy to. Don't see any. Let's see.
Please unmute yourself and speak. So maybe you want to repeat that.
Yes. If there are any questions, please unmute yourself and ask.
Phil, this is David.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, yes. Who's
Excellent.
talking?
This is David Marinick.
David, hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
So, okay, I'm doing well, thanks. I was struck by how much this is an exercise it seems more in urban planning than urban design, because I have a hard time seeing it as a design that tells me that it's the city of God. And it seems like that's partly because your golden age looked like 1936, and it doesn't seem to, in any specific way, harken back to older ideas of what the city of God realized on earth would look like. And could you talk about that?
Well, let's see. I wouldn't characterize 1936 as a golden age. Let's see. I will say that with respect to planning and urban design, that there is definitely just because of scale issues and because of all of the larger issues within which urban design takes place, I think require require a disciplined and holistic view of planning. I mean, I think that one of the things that's interesting about Burnham is that for Burnham, architecture and planning were not separate disciplines. And it's interesting that at the Centennial, all the Chicago architects, were basically trashing Burnham, and all of the planners were basically lionizing him. But all of the planning has become basically policy planning. And so part of the ambition of this project, I would say, is to, in some ways, is to remarry or reconcile issues of regional planning and design down, not only at the scale of urban design, but down to the scale of buildings. Now, in the studios, in addition to looking at these kinds of regional issues and their impact, students were asked to do urban design projects, in local settings, and those are documented actually on the website afterburnham.com. Although, in fairness, I want to say that there's probably less time given to those urban design projects, particularly for the two studios who were working at the scale of the city and the scale of the region. There was less time that they had to do urban design projects than some of the other studios that have followed that, where I've given them sites within this plan where they can actually, get to urban design and get to building design. So, yes, that I think. You're correct in your assessment of that. But I think it's an important thing to do. With respect to City of God, I think that wow, this is a tough one. See, I guess because I'm saying that Chicago, the ambition, which I characterize as a sacramental ambition, is the idea that Chicago, to the extent that it's beautiful, like any place to the extent that it's beautiful, participates in the city of God. And so, it has to do with that sense of participation. I mean, there's a sense in which, yes, it is, when it's beautiful, it is the city of God. But at the same time, it's proleptic, it's historical, it's in a given moment. And so, I guess my sense of our ideals, the ideals of designers, that they're in part formal, but that they're more than formal. And I would, and I don't disparage that difference of emphasis, but I was trying to look at other issues in addition to the formal and the sacred. So hence the title, The Sacred and the Mundane. Anyway, thanks for the question. I don't know if that answers it, but that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
I'm going to reserve my comments at the very end, but if there are no other questions.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending, and
Thank you.
have a good afternoon.